The rain falls. It falls on the packed earth of the Chiron airfield. It streaks the canopy of a Mitsubishi Zero fighter. A young man stands beneath the wing. The water drips from his flight cap. He does not seem to notice. His face is a mask of shadows. Only his eyes catch the dim light. They are old eyes in a young face. Around him, the rising sun flags hang heavy. They are sodden with rain. They do not flutter. They droop like silent, weeping sentinels guarding a sacred rite. This is the autumn of 1944. The war is turning against Japan. A new kind of storm is gathering on the horizon. A cigarette glows in the darkness. Another pilot leans against a fuel drum. The smoke curls from his lips. It mingles with the mist rising from the ground. No one speaks. The air is thick with unspoken words. The low rumble of an engine being tested somewhere in the distance is the only sound. It is a mournful sound. It is the sound of machinery preparing for a terrible purpose. These are not just pilots. They are becoming something else, something forged in desperation. They are to become the Tokutai, the special attack units. The world would come to know them by another name, Kamikaze, Divine Wind. Inside the dimly lit hangar, a different kind of life exists. It is a life of waiting, of quiet ritual. A young man sits on a wooden crate. He is carefully trimming his fingernails. He places the clippings into a small envelope. These are for his mother, a final piece of himself to send home. Nearby, another pilot writes a letter. The scratch of his pen on the thin paper is a small, intimate sound. It cuts through the damp air. These are the sounds of boys becoming ancestors. They are preparing not for a mission, but for their own memorial. They are boys of 18, 19, 20 years old. They should be thinking of university, of baseball, of love. One such pilot was Corporal Yukio Araki. He was just 17. A photograph shows him holding a puppy. He is smiling. It is a genuine boyish smile. Just hours after that photo was taken, he would fly his final mission. He wrote a letter to his family. It was a letter of farewell. He tried to be brave. He tried to be the son his nation expected him to be. His words, however, betray a quiet sorrow, a longing for a life he would never live. Another voice echoes from the past. It belongs to Ichizo Hayashi. He was a university student. His letters reveal a thoughtful, philosophical mind. He wrestled with his fate. He questioned the meaning of his sacrifice. To be honest, he wrote, I cannot say that the wish to die for the emperor is genuine. He continued, I am going to die for the emperor, because I am ordered to. These were not the words of a fanatic. They were the words of a young man trapped by duty, trapped by a code of honor that offered no escape. He was caught in the gears of a vast, unpitying machine. These were the voices of the Kamikaze. They were not faceless demons. They were not mindless drones. They were sons. They were brothers. They were students who loved poetry. They were farm boys who missed their villages. They listened to Western music in secret. They read forbidden books. They wrote letters filled with love and regret. They were profoundly, tragically human. The name itself was a powerful piece of propaganda. Kamikaze, Divine Wind. It reached back through the centuries, to the year 1281. A massive Mongol fleet sent by Kublai Khan threatened to invade Japan, but a powerful typhoon rose from the sea. It smashed the fleet to pieces. The Japanese believed it was a miracle, a wind sent by the gods to protect their sacred islands. Now, in 1944, Japan needed another miracle. The nation was on its knees. The American war machine was closing in. The old story was resurrected. It was given a new, terrible meaning. This time, the divine wind would not come from the heavens. It would be created by men, young men. They would become the typhoon. They would hurl themselves at the enemy. Their bodies, their planes, their very souls would be the storm. This was the doctrine. It was preached by military leaders. It was championed by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. He is considered the father of the Kamikaze Corps. He argued that this was the only way, the purest sacrifice, the ultimate expression of the Japanese spirit, Yamato Damashi. It was a grim calculus of desperation. The pilots were told their sacrifice would save the nation, that it was an honor beyond measure. They were told their death would be as beautiful as a falling cherry blossom. They were told they would become Eiri, guardian spirits of the country. They would be enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. They would be worshipped as gods. But behind the myth, there was a brutal reality. Japan was running out of everything. Fuel, experienced pilots, modern aircraft. The kamikaze tactic was born of this poverty. It was cheaper to train a pilot for a one-way mission. It was more effective to use an old plane as a guided missile than to risk it in a dogfight against superior American aircraft. The divine wind was not just a spiritual concept, it was a cold, pragmatic military strategy. It was a way to turn a human being into a weapon, a final, desperate roll of the dice. The night before a mission was a time of ritual, a time of farewell. The pilots would gather for a final ceremonial dinner. They were served sake, the traditional rice wine. They would toast the emperor. They would toast each other. They would sing patriotic songs. But beneath the forced cheerfulness, a heavy silence lingered. Each man was alone with his thoughts. Each man was contemplating the end. They were young men on the brink of eternity, and they had so much left to say. So they wrote. They wrote letters home, to their parents, to their siblings, to sweethearts they would never marry. These letters were their final testament, their last chance to connect with the world they were leaving behind. They were called Isho, last testaments. They were filled with expressions of gratitude. "Dear mother and father," one pilot wrote, "thank you for the 23 years you have cared for me." Another wrote, "Please do not be sad. I am happy to die for our country." The words were often formal. They followed a script, but the emotion bled through the ink. They also wrote poems, death poems or jisei. It was an old samurai tradition, a way to capture the final moment of life in a few elegant lines. These poems were often about nature, cherry blossoms, the moon, the changing seasons. They were a way of finding beauty in the face of oblivion. "If only we might fall," wrote pilot Masanobu Kuno, "like cherry blossoms in the spring, so pure and radiant." The poetry was a shield, a way to frame their death not as an end but as a part of a natural, beautiful cycle, a final, graceful act. These letters and poems were more than just goodbyes. They were a promise that their sacrifice had meaning. They were writing their own eulogies. They were shaping the memory that they would leave behind. They sealed these letters in envelopes. They entrusted them to their commanding officers, to be mailed after their deaths. It was a final, sacred trust, a message in a bottle sent from the edge of the world, a whisper from the past, asking to be remembered, not as monsters, but as men. The morning of the mission arrived. The air was cold, the sky gray, pilots dressed, ate rice balls, and received a final sake cup from a senior officer, speaking of honor and duty. They walked to their planes with quiet purpose, swords, and hachimaki headbands. They climbed into their Zeros as the ground crew bowed, sealing the canopies. Engines roared to life. Takeoff was the point of no return, with just enough fuel for a one-way trip. The American fleet appeared, their target, their destiny. This was the final act. The dive. The world blurred as they screamed toward the sea. The result was chaos. For the American sailors, a diving Zero was a vision from hell. The sirens wailed, anti-aircraft guns opened up, and the sky filled with flak. Sometimes they got lucky and the Japanese plane would explode, but often they got through. When a kamikaze hit, the effect was devastating. The plane was a flying bomb. The impact would tear a gaping hole in the ship's deck. The explosion would send shrapnel and fire across the vessel. The ship would become an inferno. Over the war, nearly 4,000 Japanese pilots were sent on these suicide missions. Their attacks sank or put out of action over 300 Allied ships, killing nearly 5,000 American sailors. The most successful attacks came during the Battle of Okinawa. They were a terrifyingly effective weapon, but it came at an unbearable cost. For every ship they damaged, dozens of young men died. The aftermath was a scene of two tragedies. How does a nation convince its young men to embrace death? Through propaganda. From birth, they were raised in absolute obedience. They were the emperor's children, belonging to the state. The government controlled every aspect of life, broadcasting the same message. Japan was sacred, the Japanese superior, and death for the emperor, the greatest glory. Propaganda showed heroic pilots flying into the enemy, celebrated as saviors, willing gods of war. This created psychological pressure. To refuse was a betrayal of family, ancestors, God. The story of the kamikaze is a cautionary tale about the power of belief twisted to serve a dark cause. The war ended. The emperor announced the surrender. For surviving kamikaze pilots, it was a moment of profound confusion. They had been prepared to die, but the nation was not saved. The American occupation began. The kamikaze were suddenly a source of shame. The pilots struggled to find their place in a new Japan that was trying to forget the war. Many hid their past. The kamikaze became a potent symbol. In the West, they were often seen as brainwashed fanatics, but in Japan, over time, they were seen less as symbols of militarism and more as tragic figures who had sacrificed everything for a lost cause. The ghosts of those pilots still haunt the waters of the Pacific. They are a reminder of the human cost of war. Today, in the heart of Tokyo, is the Yasukuni Shrine. Here, the spirits of the kamikaze pilots are worshipped as deities. In Chiron, there is a peace museum dedicated to the pilots. Here, the focus is on humanity, on the tragedy of youth lost to war.